Well, this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Mr. Didier Ghez, presenting his new book, They Drew as They Pleased, The Hidden Art of Disney's Musical Years. Mr. Ghez is the author of the previous books, Disney's Grand Tour, Disneyland Paris, and They Drew as They Pleased, The Hidden Art of Disney's Golden Age. For this book, Mr. Ghez has unearthed hundreds of enchanting images, from early sketches to polished concepts for iconic features by 5 exceptional artists who shaped the style of the Disney Studios animation during the period of the 1940s. Here to tell us more about it and share images with us, please welcome to the podium Mr. Didier Ghez.
Hi, good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for watching on the internet. So I'm really excited to be here to present that second volume of the They Drew as They Pleased series. For those of you who weren't here last year, the series is a series of 6 volumes which deal with Disney's concept artists. And the concept artists at Disney are really the artists who inspire the other artists. They are the best of the best that Walt hired, and that really were there to give new ideas to the other artists at the studio. So they are not animators, they are not background artists, they are really people who work on story, on character design, and on just creating new ideas for the other artists. The first volume of the series dealt with the 1930s. The second and the third volume of the series are going to deal with the 1940s, which were the most creative, which was the most creative period at the Disney studio. Now, in the past volume, we saw that the context of the times was the middle of the Great Depression, and that's how Walt Disney was able to hire the best of the best from around the world. Well, the second volume of the series, which deals with the 40s, deals with a very, very difficult time both at the studio and in the world. And the reason why it's a very difficult time at the studio is because a very traumatic event happens at the studio in 1941, in May 1941, which is a big strike is declared at the studio, and that stops production for quite a while, and that's really a turning point at the studio, which marks the end of the golden age at the Disney studio. That strike is really the result of different events, but one of the events that really leads to the strike is the fact that the European markets are closed to Disney products because of the war, because of World War II, because of the start of World War II. And that leads to tremendous pressure on the finances of the studio. That combined with some box office failures, starting with Pinocchio and Fantasia, leads to very, very difficult conditions at the studio, which means that people are unhappy, and that leads to a strike. That's the very short story. But frankly, those two big events that mark the 1940s and that dominate the 1940s are really the historical context to the story I'm telling, because the story I'm telling is really a story focused on the artists and on the creative aspects of the studio at that time. And when we look at the creative studio, the creative elements of the studio at that time, there are really 2 things that mark the studio in those years. One is that quite a lot of the projects that the studio works on at that time are linked to music, from Fantasia in the early 40s to the package features after the war, which are movies like Make Mine Music and Melody Time and so on and so forth. And all of those projects are really focused on music. And you have lots of projects also during the 40s which end up being non-produced, non-released theatrically, but which are also dealing with music, but which are abandoned during those years. And then the other big creative aspect of the studio in those years is the creation in the end of the 30s until the beginning of the 40s of a department called the Character Model Department. And so when I started dealing with the 1940s, I thought I would organize the two books that deal with the 1940s around those two creative axes. The first one, the one that we're going to present today, this evening, is the one that deals with the musical years. And then the second one, the one that I'll present next year and that I'm working on at the moment, is the one that focuses on the character design and on that department called the character model department, which sort of became a second story department. So what I'm going to do tonight is three things. The first thing is I'm going to give you a sense of the research process that went behind the creation of that book. The second thing I'm going to do is show you some of the pages of the book and some of the incredible pieces of art that were discovered during the creation of that book. And then the third thing I'll do as a bonus is sort of give you a preview of Volume 3 and just give you a few some idea of what's coming. So Volume 2, which is really the subject of the presentation tonight, deals with 5 artists who were absolutely incredible. 5 concept artists. One on the top left is David Hall. The one in the middle at the top is Sylvia Holland. The one on the right is Walt Scott, and the one at the bottom is Retta Scott on the left. And finally, the last one is Kai Nielsen. 3 were Americans. One was English, Sylvia Holland at the top, and one was from Denmark, Kai Nielsen at the bottom right. And as you can see, once again, despite what has been said in many forums and by a lot of people who are misinformed, quite a few women were actually part of the creative process and an intrinsic part, a very important part of the story department. So when you start a project like this, and each time you start one of those books, the first thing you do to start your research is to try and analyze everything that has been written before on those artists and on that subject. So I was very inspired by a book by John Kenmaker, which was published 20 years ago, which is this one. But then I started obviously looking for more documents and for new sources of information. So started discovering some correspondence from some of those artists which had never been seen before. And this is a letter from the Danish Kai Nielsen, written in those years when he was working at Disney. As you can see, part of the difficulty sometimes is with the language, like with the previous volume, which found a lot of documents in Hungarian. And part of the difficulty sometimes is just understanding the writing, right? That was not always easy to decipher. Well, aside from that, I started contacting the families of the artists. And one of the families I contacted was the family of Retta Scott, the woman you saw at the bottom left earlier. And so I contacted the sons and I asked them, I said, well, do you have anything about your mother's career at the studio? So one of the sons said, well, I have absolutely nothing, unfortunately. The other son said, you know, I might have a few things, but very, very limited. I have a few autobiographical notes from my mother, and that's about all I have. So I said, autobiographical notes, this is great, this is fantastic. For me, that's a time machine. Yeah, please send that to me. So he did. He sent me those notes, and I started reading those notes, and they were fascinating. There wasn't much. They were about 7 or 8 pages, but it was absolutely fascinating. So I started reading that. And but at the same time, in parallel, I kept insisting, and I was saying, are you sure you don't have anything else? He said, no, I have nothing else. And so when I read those notes, I realized that Retta Scott had worked for the studio until 1946 when she got married, and then left the studio and didn't work in animation for 30 years. And then in the early 80s, she got divorced, and she decided to go back to animation. So that was the end of her career and the end of her life, really. And she came back for animation for a few years, not at Disney, but at a small studio in Los Angeles. I said, this is really interesting. If she came back to animation in the 80s, there must be people who worked with her at the time who are still alive, who are still with us. So I'm going to track them down and interview them. So that's what I did. I interviewed a few of them. And when I interviewed them, one of them said, you know, there's something you should probably track down. When she worked at the studio with us, she came one day to the studio with a wonderful book of drawings about a plane and so on that she had done. She had written that book and drawn that book in 1941 with another Disney artist. You should try and track that down. I said, what? What? Really? That's really interesting. I'd never heard of that. So I started contacting the son again. I emailed him right away and said, have you ever heard of that book? He said, yeah, of course. I have that book. I have the mock-up of that book. I'm like, oh my God, okay. So that's great. But if he has that, what else does he have? So I started digging and digging and digging. And after a few weeks of diplomatically probing him, he said, you know, I might actually have a few more things. He said, I think I remember, so that's Rita Scott. He says, I think I remember that I have a few storyboard drawings from Bambi, but I didn't think that was relevant. I'm like, yeah, that's really relevant. That's really, really, really relevant. This is the first project she worked on at the studio, and that's how Walt Disney and one of the Disney directors, Dave Hand, got really excited about her work, and that's how she became the first animator, the first female animator at the studio. So yeah, that's tremendously relevant. So he said, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to go to the attic and try and see if I can find those drawings. I'm like, okay, that's great. That's great. So I kept probing and probing and probing. And after a few weeks, he said, you know, I went to the attic and I did find those drawings. And to be honest, there was a little bit more than what I thought. Well, a little bit more was around 150 original drawings. And so there were drawings from fabulous abandoned projects. So this is one of the projects about the Hopi Indians and their Kachina spirits. And that was a project that was worked on in the mid 40s that was going to be set on the music of Ferdi Grofé, Grand Canyon Suite. And it was a fascinating project, but in the end, the story didn't gel and it didn't make it to the screen. And I'm going to show you later on a few more drawings and a few more documents that were found within that collection. Well, the other person I contacted was the daughter of Sylvia Holland, a person called Theo Halliday, who's still around today at more than 95 years old. So Theo was really, really nice, and she opened the door of her house to try and find drawings. And so before I show you this image, actually, so I contacted her, and I started looking through drawings that she had prepared and so on and so forth. And that was very, very interesting. I found some really great stuff, but I didn't find what I knew was there, which were some photographs that I knew were there and a few other drawings that other historians had seen. And so I started asking her if there were other things anywhere else in their house, and she really didn't know. And then her daughter came to the house that afternoon, and I said, well, this is what I'm looking for. Do you know where that is? She said, no, I have no idea, but come with me, and let's go through the house, and let's try and find it. So we went through her house, and she said, have you looked here? Yes, I have. Have you looked here? Yes, I have. She said, have you looked in this big trunk? I said, no, I haven't. Obviously, I wasn't going to open the trunk without your mother telling me to. And she said, well, let's open the trunk together. So we opened the trunk, and I couldn't believe my eyes. The whole trunk was filled with written documents, with artwork, with treasures that literally no one had seen before in the last 70 years. So that was amazing. And then I went to the terrace where Theo Halliday was seated with a good friend of mine, Joe Campana, who's also a Disney historian who was helping me in this whole process. And when I go to the terrace, Joe says, you're not going to believe what I just heard. And I said, what did you just hear? He said, you see this big box here on the terrace? Well, this is also full of documents. And so I opened the box, and I took out an envelope from the box. I said, Joe, if what's in the envelope is what I think it is, it's going to be unbelievable. And then when I opened the envelope, it was full of drawings, not by Sylvia Holland, but by the other artist I was researching on for that project, Kai Nielsen. All drawings that had never been seen before, all things for an abandoned project, which was fascinating, on Sibelius's music, The Swan of Tuonela, and you're going to see some of those drawings later on. So that's me on the terrace looking at one of those boxes filled with documents. And some beautiful things like this one, like this Bambi drawing, and you'll see flower discreetly here on the top right. I don't know if you can see the skunk here on the top right. And it's a very delicate drawing from one of the scenes in Bambi. Other drawings like this one, preparation for the Nutcracker Suite in Fantasia. Um, and that drawing that I was mentioning earlier, there were like 10 of those drawings from Swan of Tuonela, one of the abandoned sequences for Fantasia. I mean, it was just absolute paradise, like entering Tutankhamun's tomb or something. Just incredible. And so now I wanted to show you also a few of the pages of the book, some of the key discoveries, just to give you a sense of what you're going to find in there. Um, one project I was really fascinated with when I started that new volume was a sequence that was abandoned from Fantasia, which was a bug orchestra. And I loved those drawings of the bugs. I loved those drawings of the bugs playing music. And I thought, okay, I need to find more about the guy who did those drawings. And so after a lot of research, after trial and error, I finally discovered that the person was an artist called Walt Scott. And I contacted the family, and they gave me a lot of information about him. And there is a whole chapter about Walt Scott and his art. And this is some of the art he created for Fantasia. When I saw the drawings last year at the Animation Research Library at the Disney Archives, I was just blown away. I mean, when you see that art, it just pops out of the page, and it's just incredible. And then this is a drawing by Kai Nielsen. Now, this is really funny, because what happens is, because I'm working on that book series, which has 6 volumes, I'm always like researching the next one while I'm writing the one before. And so I was really researching, when I found that piece of artwork, I was researching an artist who's going to appear in volume 3 called Campbell Grant. And I contacted the family, and I met with the family, and they had a few drawings by Campbell Grant. I met the daughter, and she had a few drawings by her father. But then at the end of the visit at her place, she said, "Oh, by the way, are you also interested in drawings by other Disney artists?" And I'm like, "Yeah, of course I am." She said, "Well, there's something that might interest you." And she came back with this incredible, never seen before piece by Kai Nielsen. And I almost fell down. I just couldn't believe my eyes. So that's another one. Then when I was working on Kai Nielsen, one of the things I discovered is that he had worked on a very little known Disney project called The Reluctant Dragon. And we had never seen any of his artwork for that project. And so I was really fascinated by that. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I found a piece of artwork by Kai Nielsen for The Reluctant Dragon? The Disney Archives didn't have anything along those lines. So I'm like, okay, well, that's probably just going to be wishful thinking. Well, when I was in touch with the other, with the son of that artist, Campbell Grant, for volume 3, at some point he said, "No, I have absolutely nothing by my father, but there's one piece of art that was given to my father by one of his friends that I'm interested in selling." I say, "Yeah, by which artist?" He said, "By Kai Nielsen." I'm like, yeah, okay, can you describe that? And he says, "Yeah, it's a piece with a dragon in front of a cave." I'm like, "What?" And so that's the piece you're seeing here. Absolutely incredible. The only piece of Kai Nielsen from Reluctant Dragon that's known to exist. So I tried to buy it, and then he had some remorse. He decided not to sell. It's a long story, but I ended up having to pay a bit of money to. Anyway, it's a long story. The piece is in the book, which is what really matters. And then just a few random pages of artwork by Sylvia Holland for, in this case, early version of the Pastoral Symphony for Fantasia. Really fun stuff, very different from what ended up in the movie. And also, I mean, in all of those documents by Sylvia Holland, I found a lot of drawings for non-produced projects. So those are drawings with Jiminy Cricket, of course, for a history of music that the studio was working on at the time, that evolved in later years, much later, into a project called Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom. But that was still a history of music at the time. And then she was working also to connect the segments of Make My Music. she was working on a project which involved the Greek muses. And so there were lots of drawings from the Greek mythology to connect those segments in that movie. And that was really fun. And she also talks about that in her correspondence, which I also discovered at the house, and which is, again, an absolute time machine when it comes to understanding the Disney studio at the time. Those are a few more Kachina spirits from that project On the Trail by Retta Scott, integrated with the characters that she was thinking could be the main characters of the story, the little Indian and some other really fun characters like the snake and others. And then I discovered a few drawings through Retta Scott again for a project which really was a complete mystery when we discovered those drawings. And based on just one of those drawings, a good friend of mine from Denmark, Hans Berg, another Disney historian who's really incredible, said, you know, I think this is a drawing based on an 1894 book called Twanet's Philip. I said, what? Twanet's Philip? And I couldn't really believe him because I had never heard of that project before, and no one had heard of that project before. And when I started checking my documentation and the things I had about the abandoned Disney projects, I realized that, yes, the studio had actually worked on a project called Twanet's Philip. And so I asked my contacts at the Animation Research Library if they knew anything about that project. They said, no, we don't know anything about that project, but let us check if we have a file on that. And they found a whole file on that project. And so between what we found at the house of the artist and what we found at the Animation Research Library, we now have the complete storyboards of that project, including that beautiful drawing of Carnival in New Orleans, since the whole story is set in New Orleans. And we have now a lot more information about what the studio was trying to do on that project. And of course, there is David Hall, which is one of my favorite concept artists, who is absolutely amazing. The drawing on the cover of Peter Pan and Wendy is by David Hall, and thanks to quite a few friends and private collections, including another Disney historian called Pierre Lambert, a French guy also, I discovered quite a few pieces that we had never seen before, like those two, which are featured in the book on a full page, and which are, I was just stunned once again when I found those. And this is just another David Hall to conclude the presentation of the interior of the book. That one just gave me a little bit of difficulty getting approved because, as you can see, he's smoking a hookah, and Disney wasn't completely super happy with that idea. But then they said, well, this is a book for adults, so it's going to be fine. They're going to understand. And after all, he does smoke the hookah in the movie also, so it's not as if it's a hidden secret. So the other thing I promised is to give you a quick idea of what's coming in the next volume of the series. This is not the final cover. This is a draft cover for the moment that hasn't been approved yet, but I'm hoping that's going to be the final cover, hopefully. And the book, the volume 3, is going to deal with 6 artists, and I'll talk about that a lot more next year. But let me tell you about 2 of the biggest discoveries for me for volume 3. One, and it's great that we're in Miami, a very Latin country, to talk about that artist. So, by the way, that whole book is going to deal with the character model department, and you see here a photograph of the character model department, which was headed by the person in the center, Joe Grant, seated in the center. And anyway, I won't talk about all of those artists tonight, but this is the character model department. And one of the big discoveries for me in the character department is an artist which I'd heard about quite a few times before, called Martin Provensen. Now, Martin Provensen is really famous these days as a children's book artist with his wife, Alice Provensen. And so I knew of his style for books, which is very stylized, very modern, very designy. But I had no idea what his style looked like when it came to his style at Disney. And so little by little, through a process that, again, I'll explain next year, I started discovering more and more of his art and understanding more and more of his art. And I was just blown away because it was very, very different. So this is an example of a concept piece he created at the very early days of his career at Disney for Ferdinand the Bull. And as you can see, very different from what happens in the movie, from what the fine line designs are, but very, very powerful. And this is an example of one of the characters he developed for Fantasia, for the Pastoral Symphony in Fantasia. Again, very different from what you can see in the movie. Incredibly powerful line, beautiful drawing, just amazing. And this is for the Reluctant Dragon. Again, that line, which is just, for me, one of the best things that I've seen from the character artist at the studio. So I'm really excited to talk about him next year. And then another artist who was an incredible discovery for me. I mean, that one was like, came out of the blue completely. I was reading an interview at some point by my good friend and historian Michael Barrère that he had conducted, I think, in the 70s. And in that interview, the person he interviewed said that, and the person he interviewed was the head of a department called the Story Research Department. And that executive said that he had hired an Ecuadorian artist called Eduardo Solafranco to work on the project for the Don Quixote. And I was like, who the heck is Eduardo Solafranco? I'd not heard that name before. Well, I started researching him, and I realized that in Ecuador, he had really become an incredibly famous painter and very, very high reputation. And so I started looking into that, and I started digging into that, and I realized that he was an incredible artist who, at the Disney studio, stayed for a very, very short while, but worked on projects like Fantasia. Here is a concept piece for Night on Bald Mountain. Worked also a little bit on Peter Pan, and unfortunately, except for that piece, none of his art for Peter Pan survived to this day. And he worked on Don Quixote. And when I say he worked on Don Quixote, I mean he worked on Don Quixote. In about 9 months, he created more than 1,000 pieces, more than 1,000 concept pieces for Don Quixote. It's unbelievable. He was more prolific than anyone else I've seen at the studio. And so we'll talk about him next year, and I'll give you more details about him next year. And so that's basically the idea for tonight. And now I think we can open it for question and answers. Thank you very much.
Folks, if anyone has a comment or a question, please raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone, or else the live stream audience watching at home will not be able to hear your question. So just let me know. I know it's always a little tough for the first hand to go up. Here you go.
So I see the drawings that you have presented. What do they do with the drawings? What happens after that?
So it really depends on the drawings, but the idea is those drawings, those concept drawings, are really that. They are concepts which are there to stimulate the ideas of the other artists. And so based on those drawings, the director of the movie, or Walt Disney himself, says, you know what, I love this direction, or I love that direction from a stylistic standpoint, or I like this gag in this drawing is really fascinating, or I like the design of that character in that other drawing, or I like the look of that background. And so based on that, little by little, they start getting an idea of where they want to go. And really, in those years, it's really Walt. Walt is really the one who takes the ultimate decision. But he has a very famous sentence, which is, it's very difficult to choose between one idea. So he loves to have multiple ideas and get really stimulated and get really lots of different points of views to, in the end, say, you know what, I think this works, I think this doesn't work, and we're going to try and go in that direction. And little by little, that helps shape the look and feel of the movie and the stories.
All right, who has the next question? All the way here in the back.
Nowadays, do they still have the drawings, or it's all computer animated?
So they do actually still have concept drawings today. They still do concept drawings manually. Some of them are done by a computer, but some of them are actually drawn still manually. So yeah, it still exists at the level of concept drawings. Now, after that, the animation itself is done via computer most of the time. Although You know, the foreword of this book was written by John Musker, and John Musker was, among others, the director of The Little Mermaid. Now, John Musker just directed a movie which is going to be released at the end of this year called Moana. And in Moana, most of the animation is done by computer, but the tattoos that are on one of the main characters, one of the gods that are one of the key characters in the movie, those tattoos are actually hand animated. I think they are hand animated by a great artist called Eric Goldberg, if I'm not mistaken. And so even today, you still have hand-drawn animation in some very specific cases at Disney. And so not necessarily everything is done by a computer.
I have a question. Didier, your enthusiasm for this subject matter is so wonderful, and the amount of research you've done is so impressive. It gets me to wonder, was your training in film or in art, or did you study journalism? How did you end up doing these books with such passion and with such love, which is obvious to everyone?
So none of the above.
None of the above.
None of the above. I'm really, my training is in business, so none of the above. But that being said, I love to read. And I love art. And when I started, when I was a kid, I got really excited, like lots of kids, by Disney. But then what also happened is I started realizing that there were artists that were doing all of this. And I'm like, okay, this is great. So it's not just the name. It's not just Walt. It's not just Walt Disney. There were people behind that were incredibly talented.
Lots of people.
And lots of people. And when I started digging into that, I was like, oh my God, they were really, really, really talented. and so I wanted to know more. And I could find a little bit more, but not much more. And so at some point I decided, okay, I need to learn a lot more about those artists, and I need to treat them like the artists that they were. And so there is a real art history that needs to be written about them, and that needs to be written seriously, not just with images, not just with text, but with the two together, and going really in depth into what they have done, into their career, into their life, and trying to really understand the full picture, the way we do it with other great artists, like the big masters and like recent modern artists. We really needed to understand those artists a lot better and to give them their own personality, separate from just the stamp Walt Disney. And so that's what I really wanted to achieve with that book series. And frankly, with all of the research that I'm conducting at the moment, because it's not just this book series, but it's a lot of other projects that basically are there to try and understand Disney history a lot better and to preserve it for future generations.
That's great. I'll see you over here.
I just wanted to understand if you could tell some clues around how the work became from concept to actually being chosen to become a movie or blockbuster. Was there anything about the period that they were trying to talk about, or the particular artist had more influence over other artists? Are there clues that you could find in terms of how the work became alive?
So it's a complex question for a lot of different reasons. It's the process is a very organic one. So it's not a very organized process. It's a very chaotic process. It's a lot of people working together. And it's also a person, Walt Disney, who's highly unpredictable. He's a genius, without a doubt. He's great at story, but he's highly unpredictable. Even the artists who worked with him for years and years and years would still say at the end of their career, we still can figure out what Walt would have done. We still can figure out what he would have decided. He was Walt. There was only one of him, and he was the only one who knew in the end what he really wanted. So it's difficult to give you general rules. At the same time, the other thing is you can see that Walt, before 1941, before the strike, is trying to innovate more and more and more with the art of animation, with personality animation, with how much the character become real in terms of believing in them, and so on and so forth. He's also trying to innovate a lot with technology in Fantasia. He's trying to innovate also artistically, again, in Fantasia, trying to do something that no one else had done before him. And then the war happens, and then the strike happens, and then the failures at the box office happens. And that really breaks the momentum. That really takes him to a very, very tough period where he's a bit lost. He doesn't know the studio almost goes bankrupt. I mean, if it weren't for Dumbo, which really saves the studio from bankruptcy, and if it weren't for the war, which really brings a lot of work to the studio because of training material for the army and so on and so forth, the studio would probably have gone bankrupt. And so in those years until 1950, he's really lost. And then in 1950, he sees the opportunity again. I mean, in the late 40s, he sees the opportunity again to relaunching the studio. And so the first big animated feature that's released after the war is Cinderella. And that's what relaunches the studio, really. But by then, you can feel that Walt is not as interested in animation. He's starting to focus on other things. He's going to start focusing very quickly on live action. He starts focusing really quickly also on the theme park that he has in mind. And so he leaves a little bit animation behind. And so then the process again shifts. And it's, again, he has lots of influence still on the process, but some of his other artists start also influencing the decision process. So it's very difficult to give you a clear answer, and it's that's probably one of the toughest questions to answer, frankly. So they were inspired by those drawings a lot, but again, some influenced them more than others.
Thank you for the enthusiasm in this work. It shows through. A question is, do you find in general the artists which had sort of special notoriety or that you were more excited about had a particular education, training, background, or experience compared to other artists that maybe had some sort of influence?
So that's very interesting. That's a very, very interesting question. So, I mean, there are a few things that are really, really clear here. In the first volume, you had 4 artists, and the 4 artists were coming from outside of the US. So really clearly, in terms of concept artist, Walt, when he started establishing that concept artist ID, which wasn't called at the time concept artist. He wasn't thinking of them as concept artists, but he really gave them more freedom than to other artists at the studio. So when he started establishing that, he was really looking for new ideas. And I think the fact that those 4 artists were coming from outside of the US is not a complete coincidence. And then in volume 3, which is also a really good example, the character model department that he establishes in the mid to late 30s is filled with artists who have studied art, who are very exposed to the masters, who have a knowledge of art history and the artists from Europe and from around the world, which is way, way, way beyond what their colleagues know about those artists. So again, that's not completely a coincidence, and they become very, very influential in the late 30s and early 40s, and then they spread throughout the studio when the department is dissolved, and they carry on influencing the Disney movies until the 50s and 60s, even though most of them have left the studio by then. So yes, there is a profile for quite a lot of those artists, which is very special. Not so much for the artists who are in volume 2. There I would have more difficulty giving you something that makes them stand out.
Just a question in regards to Walt Disney. Recently I went to the Dali Museum and I saw that their late exhibition was Walt Disney. And they were talking, they exhibit when Dali and Walt, they worked together. Would you be able to talk just a little bit about it?
Yeah, of course.
That was very interesting. I personally had no clue that they ever worked together, and I actually saw they had some pictures of their work and what Dali presented to Walt, but I thought that it was very interesting.
So in the 1940s, in the early 1940s, Walt Disney goes to South America with his artist. And at some point in the mid-40s, they start thinking about doing a project around a piece of music called Destino. And when they think about that, they think about different ideas. And at some point, they invite Dali, and I believe it's in around 1945, 1946. Dali's in Hollywood, and they invite him to come to work for the studio and to try and do something around that piece of music called Destino. And so Dali comes to the studio. He has no idea of animation. He has no idea how the whole process works. He's Dali. And he comes at the studio, I believe, with his cape and with his style. And he's Dali. And he has his own office and so on. And he's assigned another artist who is a marvelous Disney artist called John Hench to help him figure out how he can adapt his ideas for animation. And so he develops a whole concept around a woman dancer and really, really, really crazy Dali-esque ideas about death and about rebirth and about baseball. Uh, and so at some point, Walt, who I think pays him quite a bit, enters his office, and Dali is surrounded by those photographs of baseball players. And Walt really doesn't understand what's going on there. And basically, I think that's the end of the relationship at that point, and the project doesn't move forward. Although the project then moves forward about 10 years ago. Roy E. Disney, Walt Disney's nephew, decides that he wants to revive the project. And he decides to revive the project with some artists, including a French director, who basically take the project to fruition, and the project has been released. Destino was released as a short, a beautiful short. And so that's a fun story. Now, there's another fun story about Destino, which is that when Dali was working on Destino, he worked really, really, really closely with that other artist, John Hench. And so their style started mirroring each other. And in fact, what's really funny is that John Hench started giving some tips to Dali on perspective and on some things that Dali had difficulty figuring out for some reason. And so they started really becoming really good friends and working really together. Well, at some point, I think in the 70s or 80s, the drawings from Destino get stolen from the studio. And when they reappear, they reappear about 10 or 15 years later in a gallery. And John Hench starts laughing when he sees what has reappeared, because the one dealer along the way has authentified all of the drawings as being from Dali. And obviously John Hench knows that half of them are actually his. so that's a fun story. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's a question over here.
Do you know how people reacted about having a talented woman on that time working in the studio?
Well, yeah. I mean, you had women at the studio. You had quite a few women at the studio, but most of them, until the mid-30s, were in the ink and paint department. That's they were either secretaries or they were working on ink and paint. And then in 1935, as I explained in the first volume of the series, you have one woman called Bianca Majoli who becomes part of the story department. And frankly, she has a really, really hard time adapting because it's very masculine humor still in those years. And there's a historian who says she was like a doll, a porcelain doll in a monkey cage. That's what how he pictured her, and that's really the case. I mean, she's really, really fragile, and in that very, very masculine environment, she does a nervous breakdown. She really can't really stand it, and it's very tough for her, and that's very sad. Well, those other two women that worked for the studio were not like that at all. They had very strong personalities. I mean, Sylvia Holland was much older than most of her colleagues, and so she had no problem. She had been a truck driver at some point in her life. She was raising two kids without a husband because her husband has passed away earlier on. She had a very tough life, and she knew how to fight, and she was a wonderful architect. Also, she was trained as an architect. She was an incredible draftsman, much better than a lot of the artists at the studio at the time. So she was respected, and she could make herself respected. And then Retta Scott. Well, Retta Scott, she was a great artist, and she could withhold her liquor, to be honest. She could drink with the boys and without any problem whatsoever. So, yeah, they integrated really well. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yep, that's right. So it's really fun. It's actually it's a really good question. So it's a really good question. In reality, they weren't, and it's really funny because that question was asked to an artist called Ward Kimball, and Ward Kimball is always really a character. He's one of those animators who really always wanted to be different from the others, and who's really fun when you hear him talk and so on. And he owned a train in his house, and he's a fantastic character. And Ward experimented in the 60s and 70s. He did experiment with drugs, and he said, I experimented with LSD, but he said on Dumbo, absolutely not. Our only drug was the fun we were having working on the feature. That was it. That was our drug. And obviously that's a movie, Dumbo, like Alice in Wonderland, which was then rediscovered by and Fantasia for that matter, who were then rediscovered by the hippie generation, and they loved it. And you have, in fact, Disney created those incredible posters in the 60s and 70s for Alice in Wonderland, which are like very, yeah, there you could really think that Alice had smoked something. So.
Who else has a question? Here we go. All right.
You've clearly uncovered or rediscovered a lot of true treasures here from these people that you've interacted with, the family members, et cetera, and probably collected far more than you could possibly utilize in the series, I assume. Is there some way to keep those out into the open rather than going back in the trunk? I mean, are there organizations or museums or libraries that would take them and keep them to preserve them?
So it's interesting because what I do when I discover those drawings in private collections and in the collections of the families is the first thing I do with some colleagues and friends is to make sure that all of those pieces of art are properly digitized and scanned in high resolution so that they will be available for future historians and generations to come if the families agree. That's one thing. But then what happens to the actual pieces of artwork is really the family's decision or the collector's decision. And so they do have a few options at their disposal, depending on what their objectives are. So some are more interested in generating money with those pieces of artwork, and that's fair. And that's one approach. So they can sell them via auction. Some of them are really interested in the company getting those pieces back. So they then talk with the Walt Disney Company and with the Animation Research Library, and agreements can be found there too. And then some are interested in having those pieces of artwork preserved by the Walt Disney Family Museum, which is not linked to the Walt Disney Company, which was created by Walt Disney's daughter, Diane Disney Miller, and which is in San Francisco. And so that's another decision that they can take. So they have various options at their disposal, and really, again, depending on who they are and what their private situation is and so on and so forth, they take different decisions. So the good thing is, from a historical standpoint, the pieces are being preserved, at least digitally, for generations to come.
Any last questions? Question or comment? Okay, here.
Well, Walt was an artist, yes, but obviously, if the question is, did he draw? Yes, he drew. At the beginning of his career, he drew. And he then realized that he wasn't as good as his artists at drawing, but that he was absolutely great at storytelling. And he was also absolutely great at building a company. And so those two strengths. And I couldn't stress enough the fact that he was great at story, and everyone will tell you that. But I can't stress enough the fact that he was also great at building a company. And I think one of the biggest discoveries that I'm making when I'm working on that book series is how good he was at building a company. Again, in this volume, when I started researching those musical years, you see him in 1937 buying the music of Paul Dukas, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, buying the rights for that music to adapt it as a Mickey short at the time, or featurette, which then becomes part of Fantasia. Well, almost the same months as he does that, he hires someone, a composer called Heinrich Tendler, to head up a new department he creates within the company, which is the music library. And so you can see him thinking ahead that not only does he want to be really creative, but he wants to give all of his artists the means to create what he wants to create. And so for that, he creates new departments within the company. He hires the right people, and he really puts the structure in place that they need to be as creative as they are. So how is he trained? Well, he didn't go very far in his school education. And to be completely honest, by memory, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly at what age he left school. He went, if I remember well, to the Chicago Art Institute for a while, but he didn't get a very thorough art training, and he knew that, and he tried to learn during his whole career, not just about art, but about lots of other things. And he was an incredibly curious mind, and he had a memory which was really an incredible memory. Basically, all of the people who worked with him will say that they told him something 5 years earlier, and he would still remember that thing 5 years later, and those would be minute details. So he had a really, really, really strong memory and a curiosity which was all-encompassing. So he was really self-taught and tried to train himself as much as possible all the time.
All right, folks. Then if there are no more questions, quick reminder for our internet audience watching at home that you still have time to call the number on your screen and we can ship the book to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the hidden art of Disney's musical years, as well as the previous title, The Hidden Art of Disney's Golden Age, for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Didier is going to be signing here at the table to the left of the screen. And these are wonderful presentations. It's so great when you come by, and you have to promise that you'll be back next year for Volume 3.
I'll be back next year.
All right, we're going to hold you for that. Please give another hand to Didier Ghez. Thank you very much.